Hello and welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I am John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is delighted to have with us one of my favorite local authors, Liana De La Rosa, whose new book is Anna Maria and the Fox, which was just published this April to great acclaim. It's actually, I think, a pick of the Book of the Month Club. Is that
Yes,
correct?
that's correct.
That's wonderful. Before we begin today, for those listening in, I'd like to let them know that the Poison Pen does have copies of the new book on order, and we would be happy to hold one for you or put it in the mail. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore. And now I would like to welcome Liana.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for joining us. I always like to find out about who the author was before they started writing, because sometimes that shapes their career. And you've had a rather colorful career resume. What can you tell us about your life before becoming a writer?
So I've always had a deep love of books and of literature. And I fancied that one day I would be an English teacher or, a literature professor. And I still remember almost every single English teacher I had in middle school and high school, because they really shaped my love of reading. And when I went to school at the University of Arizona, I majored in English with the intention of becoming an English teacher. And then when I graduated, I took a year off. I was burnt out. I just wanted to work and just kind of regrow brain cells. And then I never went back to school, as sometimes happens. And I did a multitude of different things. I worked for a mystery shopping company. I ended up having an opportunity to buy it. And we sent out mystery shoppers to different businesses, apartment complexes, auto dealerships, restaurants, to report back on their customer service and their sales skills. And that was very interesting. And my husband and I ate really great at some of these restaurants during that time. And then I also worked for a very large pecan orchard here in the state of Arizona. I worked for them for, maybe 5 years.
Wow.
I ran their small wholesale division. So I oversaw like boutique sales and stuff of that nature. And I learned so much, and I actually had a lot of fun at that job. I know you think like selling pecans, but I got to go to food shows, and I learned a lot about agriculture, and it was just a really great experience. I really enjoyed it. And I actually stopped working there when after my first child was born, and I became a stay-at-home mom. And that's when my love of romance sort of went into overdrive, because now I had time to read, and romance novels were the perfect escape. And that's when I sort of rediscovered my love of literature, and then that morphed into my new career as a writer.
What was your initial path to publication like? Because if I understand correctly, it was your husband that pushed you into writing.
He did. I was staying home with our 2 children. And as I mentioned, I was reading a lot of romance novels.
Mhm.
And he asked me one day why I didn't write my own book. And at the time, I remember telling him I wasn't smart enough to write the kind of books that I like to read. And he gave me that very patient look that, your loved one gives you when they think you're acting like an idiot. And he's like, so why don't you learn? And I thought, yeah, why don't I learn? And so I did. I joined Romance Writers of America, and I started to involve myself in romance circles on Twitter and Facebook. I took classes, and I started to enter writing competitions, which at the time was a very popular way to sort of get feedback on your manuscript, because the judges were usually editors or agents or more established authors. And through one of those contests, I finaled, and the editor was an editor at Entangled Publishing. And she loved my book, and Entangled ended up buying it. And I wrote a 4-book series for them. called Once Upon a Scandal. And it was such a wonderful introduction to publishing. They're a smaller press. And it was a great way to kind of dip my toes in the waters of publishing and kind of figure out exactly what sort of historical romance novels I wanted to write. And that experience with Entangled led me to now my new release with Berkeley called Ana Maria and the Fox.
What can you tell us, or what would you like readers to know about your new book?
So my new book follows a trio of sisters. They're the Luna sisters, Ana Maria and her younger sisters, Isabel and Gabriela, or Gabby. They flee French-occupied Mexico when the French Napoleon III's forces were marching on Mexico City. They flee to London to seek refuge with their uncle, who is the Mexican ambassador. And while there, they are supposed to lay low and not call attention upon themselves, but instead their uncle asked them to be sort of goodwill ambassadors and boost the profile of the Mexican people, because he is petitioning members of parliament, basically the government, for an intervention in the occupation in Mexico. And while they are there, Ana Maria meets up-and-coming Parliament star Gideon Fox, who is a biracial member of Parliament who is championing a proposal to close up loopholes in the Atlantic slave trade, which is a cause very close to his heart, as his grandmother was a formerly enslaved woman. And Gideon is very ambitious, very nose to the grindstone, focused on his career. And so when he meets Ana Maria, he's charmed, but knows that their future doesn't lie together, because one, she's going to return to Mexico one day. Two, she's not the sort of bride that, you know, an up-and-coming Parliament star would need. And then three, she has a fiance that she left behind in Mexico, a political fiance for a marriage that was arranged for her. But nevertheless, there is a lot standing in their way. But of course, this is a romance novel, so they're going to find their way together.
I thought it was wonderful because on the one hand, you're giving romance readers something they're very familiar with and they love, which is the Victorian historical setting, but you're adding in things that we haven't really seen before the historical genre. I mean, the whole idea of Mexican heroines, and to be honest, I knew very little about the French occupation of Mexico, other than I think they had like a ruler there for a time being, and I can't remember.
Did.
Yeah,
it's Maximilian the First.
that was it. Yeah, Carlotta. Yeah, I remember.
His wife.
But that's it. So why did this appeal to you as a writer? What about that kind of snippet of history said, I need to use that in my story?
Well, I always kind of played with story ideas that were, I guess, a little different, a little outside of the norm of historical romance. And I hadn't been able to find a home for them. And I knew that with traditional publishing, publishers want something that's familiar but different. And I happened to be researching immigration records for another character who I knew was from Latin America, but I wasn't quite sure where. And while researching these immigration records, I came across numbers from Mexico, and it kind of just got me thinking like, what was happening in Mexico at this time? And it just kind of made me curious. And so I went and looked it up and was like, oh, that's right, the French occupation of Mexico. And I kind of just fell down a wormhole because I knew of the occupation, but I didn't know the details. And as a Mexican American, I was sort of appalled by that. And it got me thinking about how I know more about like British history or Eurocentric history than I do about my own cultural history or about the history of our closest neighbor to the South. Like it just kind of got my head spinning. And while I was researching the occupation and everything kind of happening at that time, this like idea started to germinate. And I was like, I wonder how I can marry this idea of three sisters from Mexico, but in London, because I wanted it to be in a setting that was familiar to historical romance readers. And that's where I came up with the Luna sisters fleeing to London to their uncle. And I thought it was really exciting because I knew that it would, like I said, ground it in a setting that was familiar, but the heroines were so Mexican. Like I wanted them to, their whole outlook on life, how they viewed society, like all their sensibilities, I wanted them to be influenced by their upbringing in Mexico. And I wasn't sure if that would appeal to publishers. And I was very lucky that my agent immediately was like, yes, this is a great idea. She knew that Bridgerton was coming out. Like when I first came up with the idea, it was right before season 1 came out. So she kind of had an inkling that publishers would be looking for more diverse historicals. And so when I did go on submission with this project, it was after the first season had launched. And I think I definitely benefited from that, and it was a matter of luck. And I'm so glad that this mix of the familiar with the different and new resonated, with my editor and publisher. And I hope it resonates with readers too.
It seems to be, it's gotten a lot of acclaim. What kinds of research was involved? Because a lot of times people think, oh, you're writing a novel, you make everything up. But especially with historical fiction, you have to ground it in reality. So what kinds of research did you do for this series? Do you have particular sources that you went to, like diaries or archives, or how did you go about creating that world for your characters?
So I happen to be one of those people that like never threw away her or sold back her college textbooks. So when I was at the University of Arizona, I had taken several Mexican history courses, and I just never sold back those history books. And even as I grew older and moved houses multiple times, I always lugged them with me. And I remember my husband's like, why are you keeping these old textbooks? I was like, I don't know, but I just want them. So I'm going to keep them. So when I started researching for this, and this, I did it initially to kind of reacquaint myself with the era and what was happening. I had multiple textbooks from this time, and I ordered others. One was Juarez and Maximilian. I have one about Maximilian and Carlota, his like wife. I had an old textbook of women in Mexico, which was set exactly in the 1800s. Around where the book is set. And I kind of did some cursory reading through there to kind of get a feeling for what life was like and what the major concerns were. But I'll be really honest, I saved a bulk of my research for after my first draft was written, because I have a tendency to put a lot of historical details into the first draft that it overwhelms the romance. So as a way to check myself, I will write the book first, like the first draft first, and then I notate where I want to add certain historical details or information. And then I come back to it later, because I have to remind myself this is a romance. So I have to keep it centered. And then once I kind of have a working draft for the book, then I know what sort of historical details are important, or the ones that I want to include in that matter. And so that's kind of worked really well for me in this instance, because there was so much going on at this time with like geopolitical politics. And I would have just added so much like extemporaneous stuff, just because I think it's really fascinating. So this helped me to kind of streamline what was important to the actual romance, what was important to the sisters and them navigating their new home in London. And then, as sad as it made me, I had to trim out other details that didn't necessarily add to those two things. But I added an author's note with like additional information at the end of the book about kind of what was happening in the world at the time. And that was my small way of like slipping in those details that I didn't necessarily get to add to the actual book itself.
What surprised you the most about this time period when you were researching it? Did you discover things that you thought, wow, that really, I never would have thought of that happening?
Yes. Well, actually multiple things, but the one that stands out the most to me is, so the US is and remains Mexico's biggest ally. And what I had not realized was during this time that the French were establishing the Second French Empire in Mexico, was that the US was embroiled in the Civil War. And because of that, they could not step in and enforce the Monroe Doctrine, which was an agreement that there would be no European, basically colonization in the quote unquote New World. And the US was in a very precarious situation because they were obviously fighting and battling out the Civil War. Two, there were members of the government that were very hesitant to intervene in what was happening in Mexico because they were worried that the French would support the Confederacy. And if they had, how much different would history have played out if they did that? And I think about that a lot, and how I know that during this time that Benito Juarez's wife, who Benito Juarez was the president of Mexico at this time, she was actually living in the United States during the conflict, and she was personally lobbying for support from the US government and the government, like members of the military, like generals, were sending supplies and weapons to support the liberal government that had been ousted, Benito Juarez's government. They were sending supplies, guns, whatnot to them, but they couldn't outright support them because they were walking this fine line where they didn't want to upset the French, and yet they were also wanting to support, Mexican sovereignty. And they never did recognize Maximilian and his empire in Mexico. They remained steadfast supporters of the Juarez government. But I just think little details like that, I didn't know, if the French had thrown their support behind the Confederacy, just how different US history could have played out. I find that fascinating to think about.
It really is that time period we tend to think just of the US, but the Civil War did have ramifications, because even by setting your book in Great Britain, Britain was the US didn't want to kind of tip them over into the Confederate side either because of their cotton connection there.
Oh, absolutely. And there was a sentiment among British aristocracy that related to the Confederacy, those genteel Southern manners, the sort of social quote unquote hierarchy that existed within a lot of Southern society that they class conscious Europeans really appreciated. So there was a lot of sympathy and there was a lot of members of not just British society, but European society who were hoping that the Confederates were able to, pull out a victory. Thank goodness for all of us, they didn't, but I thought that was really interesting. And another thing I hadn't thought about, and I should have, I think about it and I'm like, of course, there was a lot of racist attitudes regarding Napoleon's defeat of the Mexicans, especially Benito Juarez, who was the first indigenous president of Mexico. There was a lot of sentiment that he was not worthy of overseeing Mexico, and that they needed a stronger figure or someone who was quote unquote civilized. Just a lot of racist overtones that, as I mentioned, I should have expected, but I didn't until I was reading some of the newspaper headlines from that time. And it was quite awful. And I included a little bit of that in the book because I felt like that was important for the sisters to confront.
Yeah, it was something they would have to face realistically in the British social circle. Your hero is also involved in politics too, so that involves some research. What can you tell readers about, because Great Britain was ahead of the US in their efforts to abolish slavery?
They were. they abolished slavery much sooner than the US did, even though there were several loopholes in like the greater parts of the empire. But the US and Great Britain did come together to outlaw the Atlantic slave trade, and they worked together to stop its practice in basically American and British port cities. And my hero, Gideon Fox, the fox in the title, he thought that that wasn't good enough, that he knew that the slave trade was still existing in other parts of the world, namely during this time in places like Brazil, Cuba. There were some other locations. And for him, the fact that it existed anywhere was offensive to him, especially considering the might of the British Empire. And so he was determined that Britain couldn't consider itself the premier leader, basically, of the world if they were going to allow such a practice to continue to exist, that there was more that could be done. And so he was working with some allies to close up those loopholes that still existed. And as a biracial man during this time, he had his own microaggressions that he dealt with, his own challenges that he was facing as the son or the grandson of a former enslaved woman and a Scotsman. He had to really work hard to get to the position he was in. So he was very protective of the power that he had earned and was very mindful that he was in a precarious position, that he would be judged more harshly than his contemporaries if he stepped out of line or if he engaged in behaviors that others perhaps could do so with more ease. Gideon was not willing to take that chance because for him, this was a legacy he was determined to leave behind. It was a family legacy he was determined to honor. And so he had walked the straight and narrow, essentially up until that point, doing everything he could to see this through. And I really appreciated writing him. At first, he was a little hard to get into because he's kind of so closed up in a way. He's so protective of like his image that I kind of struggled for a bit of how to get him to open up, especially to Ana Maria, who I think she managed to chip away at him just by being curious and graceful and charming, even in the face of like aggression, like microaggressions to her face. I think he could see an ally in her. They were both outsiders navigating this society that they were not born into. And I enjoyed writing the two of them on the page together.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process. Has it evolved since you first published with Entangled? Because your books with Berkeley are a little bit broader in scope. You're given more room to work. So how did that kind of evolve? And Ana Maria and the Fox is the first in your Luna Sisters series. Did you know from the beginning, yes, I want to do these sisters, or did you do one book and they say, okay, write more? How do you navigate that as a writer?
So this process with Ana Maria and the Fox was different for me because I felt like I was in a position to truly tell the story that I had been hoping to tell. And I wasn't guaranteed that I would ever be in this situation again, to write Latinx heroines, to explore British society through their lenses, like through how they looked at the world. So I'll be really honest, I kind of just went all in. I was like, I'm determined to like throw it all in. I want them confronting racism. I want them confronting colorism. I want them I don't want to spare any of the things that I think that they would have confronted as women of color in British high society. And yet I also wanted to make it like a joyful experience. So for the first time, I think I really just wrote for myself. I allowed myself to just write the story that I wanted to tell. And I turned it in fully expecting there to be some sort of like pushback. like maybe we don't need to talk about this, or perhaps there's too much of a focus on the politics or the sisters' relationships with each other. I was prepared for all kinds of pushback, but I wanted to, this is the book I wanted to write. So I just did it. And I figured hopefully Berkeley's supportive of it. And if not, well, I did my part. Like I took my chance with it. And I was very blessed that they were like, yes, this is fantastic. And obviously, like we streamlined certain areas and we worked on them, but the actual core of the story stayed true to how I wrote it, because that was just the story I felt like needed to be told. And I know that Anna Maria and the Fox is a bit of a slow burn. A lot of the focus on the page is on the sisters' relationship. I know that although Anna Maria and Gideon are interacting with each other, they don't actually get together until much later in the book. And I try to write it in different ways to bring them together sooner, to at least get them to kiss sooner. But that's not the sort of characters that they are. They are both dutiful, honorable people who would never have acted without being pushed or forced into the situation. So it felt inauthentic to do it any other way. And I'm just very thankful that Berkeley was on board with how I wanted to tell this story. And when I first came up with the series idea, I knew that I was writing all three sisters' books. Like I knew exactly that Ana Maria would get a book, that Isabel would get a book, and that Gabby would get a book. And I had a general idea of like how each of their books would go. And I wrote up like a paragraph for each of them. Like, I think this is going to be an enemies to lovers, and I'm going to play with this dynamic. And so far, they've been really supportive of it. I actually had to turn in my synopsis. I always write a synopsis for each book because it's my first time to take the story that exists in my head and actually put it down on paper. And it gives me a good idea if it's going to work and if my characters are going to work on the page together in the way that they work in my head. So I wrote up the synopsis for the third book, which is Gabby's book. And I turned it into my editor to get approval for it. And I kind of held my breath because in the spirit of the Luna sisters, it's a little different. The majority of the book, I would say like 60% of the book takes place in Mexico.
Oh.
And then the rest of it takes place in London. And I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure that my editor would get behind that because it's like a totally different location. I wasn't sure if they would want to see the book go there. You know, I didn't know. But I figured, you know what, I'm going to try anyways. And the worst they can say is, no, we want her to stay, you know, in London. Can you fix the storyline? But they didn't.
Oh, I
know, they loved it. My editor, the very first comment in the synopsis was, oh, are we going to Mexico? She was so excited. So I'm glad that so far, the initial idea I had for the sisters is coming to fruition exactly the way I had hoped. And I've been a little, like I said, a little nervous about the reception because I know it's a little different. I know that Ana Maria's and her sister's kind of view on British society is different. And so far, the reception has been so encouraging. I'm really delighted.
That's great. And I think what your books illustrate is, I think there's this misperception on the part of people who don't read romance that it's monolithic, that all books are exactly alike, that, you know, they're all either extremely sexy or extremely sweet. There's no graduations, there's no difference in location, but what your books illustrate, and they do it beautifully, that you can do things differently, but still be part of that genre.
Yes, yes. And I love that even the way we play with tropes can be totally different depending on the book. In Ana Maria and the Fox, there's a marriage of convenience, but it's very different than the way I think some marriage of convenience books have played out. And I have Isabel's book is the book that's next. And there's a enemies to friends to lovers trope in that one. And even while I was writing it, I was like, is this what I would call it? Because it felt a little different. I'm like, yeah, that's just marketing. I'm going to call it what I want. But I love that. I love that. Yeah, tropes are a thing and we recognize them, but you can write them so very differently depending on who the writer is and the story that's being told. One of the
Mhm.
best things about romance.
That's true. For someone who hasn't read your books, how would you describe your writing voice, how you tell stories?
That is probably the hardest questions I've ever been asked. How would I describe my writing voice? I think I'm wordy.
No,
Um,
I would go with more like rich. There's a richness to your writing. Um,
that's lovely.
there's
Um,
you're kind of there's an intriguing difference. It's not something that you expect, but you appreciate in your writing. There's kind of you have that slow burn element to
mhm.
your romances. I think you're very character driven, if I had to.
Yes, I would absolutely agree with that. Almost all of my stories start with the characters, and then I build a story around who they are or who I think they are. Sometimes that changes while I write the book because I think I know them and then they start doing something different. I'm like, oh, okay, I guess not. So um yeah, I can definitely get behind that. I sometimes can get I think sometimes get lost, I think, in the weeds of like descriptions or introspection. And I have to kind of remind myself to ground it in dialogue and other things. So that's, I mean, my writing's always going to be a work in progress. But I really like to be inside characters' heads and to see the world through their eyes. And I think that shows in my
Yeah,
books.
yeah. You've been writing for a while now, so if you had the chance to go back in time to when you were first starting out, what would you tell yourself as a writer to expect about the publishing business? What advice would you give yourself?
I want to say I would tell myself to keep going, but I would have anyways. Like I just would have anyways. I I went into writing and to pursuing publishing willing to play the long game, right? I knew that it wasn't going to be a fast thing. I know that happens for some lucky people. Some lucky people are able to query and find an agent right away. Their first book sells. I thought that would be wonderful if that happened to me, but I didn't expect it. And there were a few times where I wanted to stop writing. And I just remember, honestly, I remember thinking, what would my children think if they heard that I like gave up or I stopped trying or I stopped trying to pursue this. And I didn't want them to ever think, oh, mom, well, what if you had sent out one more query letter? What if you had one more idea that your agent could pitch to editors or whatnot? I think because I went into things with that mindset that it might not happen right away, and that's okay. We'll just keep working and keep trying. It made my experience manageable, I guess you can say. And now with this experience with Anna Maria and the Fox, being with a big publisher, and not even just being with a big publisher, but being with a publisher who has shown me that they value my book and what I'm doing with it and have given me the creative freedom to tell the stories that I want to tell. I have something to compare it to because I've worked to get to this point. So I understand that I'm in that what's happened is very lucky, I guess you can say. I feel very lucky and blessed to have experienced what I did and to now be able to use that as a mirror to look at this situation that's happening now. And it makes it that much sweeter that I did it. So I
Okay.
think I would just tell past Liana, just keep going. You're going to do it anyways, but keep going because the good stuff is going to come.
Well, that's good advice. We've talked about you as a writer. Let's talk a little bit about you as a reader because you've mentioned your love of romance. Are there particular books throughout your reading life that you look back on as saying, these were books that were influential to me? These are books that I think of as being learning points. Who were some of the crucial, key favorite books in your reading life?
Definitely, I feel like I have books by so many historical romance authors that I can think back upon and just be like, yes, whether they just inspired my own creativity whether they wrote such a beautiful book that I kind of tried to study it from like a craft perspective of like, how were they able to write this scene that inspired these feelings? Like, how can I mimic that? I vividly recall reading Julianne Long's Pennyroyal Green series.
Yeah.
And she is just a poet. I don't know any other way to describe her prose, but there have been countless times while reading through those books where I literally have to put my Kindle down and just like take a moment, like, wow, what a gorgeous line. Like, what is it about her writing style? Like, how does she just string words together like that? Who else? Sarah McLean, the way she can build up tension and keep it like percolating throughout the book. It was actually a Sarah McLean novel that inspired me to be a writer in the first place, because I was reading her book, No Good Duke Goes Unpunished, in her, I cannot remember, the Fallen Angel series, I believe that's what it's called. And at the very end of the book, there's like this twist reveal about the protagonist for the last book. And I hadn't seen it coming. And it kind of like blew my mind. And that's when my husband, he happened to come home and like asked how my day had gone. And I basically word vomited all over him about this book. And that's when he was like, hey, why don't you try writing your own book? It was because of that book. Like, just, I've been trying to capture that excitement that I felt at the end of that book in like every book I've written. How do I capture like that feeling? Who else do I love? I love Minerva Spencer, who I believe you're a fan of hers as well. She just writes delicious historicals and sometimes with like quote unquote unlikable heroines. I love that her characters are so complex and rich, and how she places them in like uncomfortable situations or unique settings. Like, I just am in awe of like how she just crafts sometimes bonkers romances. Like, I just really love them. I mean, I can go on and on about my favorite historical romance writers, but those are just like a few that like stick out in my mind right now.
You've mentioned we're going to get more Luna sisters. Can you tell us, is there any hint towards a timeline when we can expect them? Or
so from my understanding, book 2, which is Isabel and the Rogue, will be out next summer.
Oh, great.
Yes, I'm very excited for Isabel's story. She is a more quiet heroine, but writing her story, she has a spine of steel, and I loved being in her head much more than I was anticipating. I really, really adore her as a character, and I hope that readers enjoy her story, because I've received feedback like, oh, I love Isabel. I can't wait to hear, her story. And I'm like, oh, good, because I love her too.
And how can readers learn more about you and your books? What social media platforms are you on?
So I am on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Oh, I guess I have a TikTok too. I am at Liana in Bloom, and I am most active on Instagram, or you can also sign up for my newsletter on my website, which is lianadelarosa.com. And I send it out monthly, so not all the time, and try to pack it with as many updates as I possibly can. But I would say Instagram and my newsletter are the best way to keep up to date on what's going on in my world.
That's wonderful. I can't believe how quickly our time has gone by. We've been chatting with author Liana De La Rosa, whose new book is Anna Maria and the Fox. I want to thank you for taking time to visit virtually with the Poison Pen, and congratulations again on a terrific start to a new series.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
I'd like to thank everyone else for tuning in to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. We hope to see you again virtually next time.